The next morning, August 14th, he was in the saddle at daybreak. When the night fell, the emperor returned to the guard's bivouac near Lidui. The information obtained from some wounded prisoners put an end to all of the emperor's uncertainties and confirmed his knowledge of a movement by Barclay de Tolly on the right bank, which he had been led to suspect since midday by the report of reconnaissance. All corps ordered to press their march to Smolensk. The emperor set out with the guard before daybreak, hoping to reach the place in advance of the Russian army, in front of which we had unknowingly defiled in going to Rosasna by way of Babinowitsky. Very early in the morning of the 15th, he galloped off to the advance guard at the gates of Smolensk. Having invested the town closely, he quickly reconnoitered the environs. The emperor appeared in force. Our troops came up, and the day was passed in bombardments and minor attacks to straighten his positions and get as near to the town as possible. On the morrow, the investment was made yet closer. A cemetery and several houses, which commanded the plateau on which the town is built, were destroyed. That evening, the emperor brought some guns into position to bombard the bridge, which could be seen plainly enough to observe troops defiling across it, some entering the town, others marching out. A little later, it was seen that these were Barclay's last corps arriving, and that part of the garrison had been relieved by them. What was the reason for this change? Did it foreshadow another retreat? The emperor was puzzled at once and became annoyed at the idea of having to march on and move yet further from his base, so as to come up with this army, which he could have forced into giving battle had he attacked 48 hours earlier. He asked me what I thought of these movements of troops. He tried to make me say that the Russians would hold and fight a battle, which was what he wanted. He was like a man in need of consolation. I thought, on the contrary, that since the Russians no longer held the initiative and were therefore unable to choose their ground, they would prefer to retire. And I said so very plainly. If that is so, answered the emperor, in the tones of a man who had suddenly reached a decision, by abandoning Smolensk, which is one of their holy cities, the Russian generals are dishonoring their arms in the eyes of their own people. That will put me in a strong position. We will drive them a little farther back for our own comfort. I will dig myself in. We will rest the troops. The country will shape up around this pivot, and we'll see how Alexander likes that. I shall turn my attention to the corps on Edwina, which are doing nothing. My army will be formidable, and my position more menacing to the Russians than if I had won 2 battles. I will establish my headquarters at Vitebsk. I will raise Poland in arms, and later on I will choose, if necessary, between Moscow and Petersburg. Delighted to find the emperor imbued with such good and sound ideas, I applauded his resolution. He seemed to me sublime, great, far-reaching, far-seeing, as in the day of his most splendid victory. I told him that this plan would really lead to peace, for it would strengthen him, step by step as he advanced, and would deter him from running too great risks. The Russian plan of campaign proved that they wished to draw him into the interior of the country, lead him further from his base, and shut him up amid the ice. It was imperative not to play their game, I added. His Majesty seemed to approve my reflections highly, and to have made up his mind at last. I hastened to report my conversation to the Prince of Neuchatel, so that he should do his utmost to hold the emperor to his wise resolutions. But the prince seemed to be doubtful whether they would survive the taking of Smolensk. Alas, how right he was. In my joy at what I heard, I too had let illusions run away with me. On the 17th, the Russians were compelled to evacuate all their positions outside the walls. The emperor brought up the siege batteries and placed 30 pieces to break down the bridge, which was plainly visible now that we were close to the town. This battery so harassed the enemy that his columns defiled across it at the double. They were clearly in full retreat. Wishing to launch an attack, the emperor Some engineer officers and some of the staff decided to reconnoitre the enceinte, but they had no scaling ladder. Finally, the reports which he received made the emperor decide to abandon that project. Toward evening, the enemy's retreating movements were unmistakable. The town had been on fire since morning, and the flames, fed by the enemy themselves, showed no sign of abating. During the night, the conflagration grew worse. It was a fearful sight, the crude prelude to what we were to behold at Moscow. Unable to sleep, I walked about. It was 2:00 in the morning, reflecting mournfully on the consequences that must ensue from this war if the emperor did not hold to the good intentions he had shown on the previous day. These scenes of horror and devastation inspired in me, I believe, a presentiment of those of which I was later to be the unhappy witness. My conversation with the emperor continually came to my mind and consoled me a little, but the Prince of Neuchâtel's observations were no less insistent, and past experience inclined me all too strongly to share his opinion and his apprehensions. The night was cold. I drew near to a fire burning before the emperor's tent, on the side facing the town, and was growing drowsy as I sat before it, when His Majesty came up with the Prince of Neuchâtel and the Duke of Istria. They gazed at the flaming town. It lit up the whole horizon, already studded with the sparkle of our own bivouac fires. An eruption of Vesuvius, shouted the emperor, clapping me on the shoulder and waking me from my stupor. Isn't that a fine sight, Monsieur le Grand Écuyer? Horrible, sire. Bah, he said. Gentlemen, remember the words of a Roman emperor. A dead enemy always smells sweet. We were all taken aback. For my own part, I at once recalled what the Prince of Neuchâtel had said, and this and the emperor's remark long haunted my inmost thoughts. I looked at the prince, and we exchanged glances as men who understood each other without speaking. At 4:00 in the morning, August 18th, some marauders who had been on the watch made their way into the town through old gaps that the enemy had not so much as repaired, and at 5:00 the emperor learned that the place was evacuated. He gave orders that the troops should not enter except in formation, but the men had already got in by several loopholes which they had opened and scaled. The emperor mounted his horse, reconnoitred the enceinte on the east, and entered the town by an old breach in the wall. He went all round the city at once and eventually stationed himself at the bridge, where he spent the day hastening its repair. The buildings in the public square and the finest houses in town had been but little damaged. The arsenal was intact, though not much of anything was left in it. Every quarter of the town had suffered. The inhabitants had fled with the army, the only people left being some old folk of the lowest classes, a priest and an artisan. They told us all they knew about what had happened in the town, but could give no information concerning the army, not even what its losses had been. The emperor seemed well satisfied, even triumphant. Before the month is out, he said, we shall be in Moscow. In 6 weeks, we shall have peace. Marshal Ney had made all preparations for crossing Dnieper, a league from the town, in order to follow up the Russians whose rear guard only was in sight. Pursuing the enemy, August 19th, he found them in position at Valentina. General Borelli, who was attached to the staff of the King of Naples, came to inform the emperor of this. He refused to believe that they would offer any resistance, or that anyhow there was more than a rear guard in position, but successive reports convinced him that it was a more considerable corps. He proceeded thither himself and immediately sent several officers to the Duke of Abrantes and even the Prince of Neuchâtel with orders to advance and engage the Russians without letting a single man escape. In the meantime, Marshal Ney had attacked and overthrown the enemy with his usual boldness, but a grenadier division sent to reinforce the rear guard held the position despite a fresh attack by Gudin's division. This general, one of the most distinguished in the army, was mortally wounded at the start of the action and lived but a short while. He died esteemed by the whole army and mourned by all who knew him. This occurrence did not hinder the troops from taking the first position, but the enemy were successfully reinforced, and the Duke of Abrantes, who was to have outflanked him and turned his left, did not come up in time. So the Russians held the crest of their position until nightfall, when the emperor reached a point which gave him a view over the whole countryside. He again sent orders to the Duke of Abrantes to act with vigor. "Barclay is mad," he said. "That rear guard is ours, even if Junot only marches here at ease." The emperor learned of the end of the affair before he reached Valentina and returned to Smolensk, highly incensed with the Duke of Abrantes, who had not acted with the vigor he had shown on previous occasions. The Prince of Neuchâtel and the Dukes of Istria and Elchingen reproached him for not having marched up fast enough. For his part, the Duke of Abrantes, whose corps was composed of foreign troops, contended that since he was obliged to march in close order so as to run no risks, his movement had been delayed by obstacles which forced him to bear to the right. From what the Prince of Neuchâtel and the King of Naples said, no such obstacles existed. I remember the different reports that were made to the emperor. At the sound of gunfire, the King of Naples went in person to the Duke of Abrantes, whose corps was in front of his own. Seeing how useful and indeed how glorious a division he could make, the king pressed him to hasten his movements. "You are annoyed at not being a marshal," he said. "Here's a fine chance. Take it. You are sure of winning your baton." While waiting for his cavalry to come up, the king placed himself at the head of Württembergers, who formed the Duke's advance guard with the object of beginning and pressing on the advance, at the same time making the Duke promise to support him. When the king put his cavalry to the charge, they would have distinguished themselves and driven back the Russians, but the Duke of Abrantes' corps did not follow up, and the king was obliged to slacken his movement for fear of being cut off. He had to wait for his own troops, who, still at some distance, were moving up at the trot. The emperor's anger can readily be imagined when he received several reports of what had taken place.